You wake up before the sun rises, not by choice, for survival. The floor where you slept all night is hard-packed earth, covered by a straw mat that has already lost half its fibers. The air inside your house is thick, almost solid, a mixture of old smoke, human sweat, and the sour smell of goats sleeping on the other side of a stone wall, so thin that you can hear every breath they take. Your entire house fits inside the bathroom of a modern apartment, and you share this space with 5, 6, sometimes 10 people. This was the reality for almost every human being who lived in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't the clean, brightly lit setting you see in the movies. It was sweat, it was hunger, it was dust that got into your eyes and never came out. But the most impressive thing isn't the hardship. It's how these people built an entire civilization under these conditions. A civilization that generated a book that 4 billion people still read today. How did they do it? What was it really like to live in that era? The answer will completely change the way you read the Bible. Let's start with the basics. The thing every human being needs before anything else, a place to live. And this is where the first surprise appears. If you imagine houses from the time of Jesus as little stone cottages with windows and wooden doors, like a miniature European village, erase that image right now. The typical house of a Galilean peasant, and we are talking about 90% of the population, was made of stones stacked without mortar, with mud stuffed into the gaps to plug the holes. The roof wasn't made of tile. It was a tangle of branches, straw, and a thick layer of compacted clay that had to be redone every year before the rainy season. Remember that story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, where the friends of a paralytic man open a hole in the roof to lower the man down to Jesus? It seems like an absurd act, almost vandalism. But when you understand that the roof was basically a crust of mud over twigs, it makes perfect sense. You could open a hole like that with your hands in less than 10 minutes. Most of these houses had a single room. One, for everything. Cooking, sleeping, eating, praying, raising children, and, pay attention, sheltering animals at night. It wasn't a metaphor. Archaeological excavations in Capernaum, the city where Jesus established his base of ministry, revealed that the houses had a split-level floor. The higher part, elevated about 30 centimeters, was where the family slept. The lower part, near the entrance, was where the goats and sheep stayed during the night. The heat from the animals helped warm the room on the cold nights of the Galilean winter, which could drop to 5 degrees Celsius. In exchange, the family breathed the smell of fresh manure all night long. That was the deal, and no one complained because the alternative was freezing. Windows were small, when they existed at all. Some houses simply didn't have them. Darkness was total after the sun went down, unless you could afford the luxury of lighting an oil lamp. And olive oil was expensive, so most families lived by the rhythm of the sun. They woke up with it, they slept with it. No exceptions, no negotiations. Now imagine the scene. You leave this house before dawn. The entire village is already moving. Small children run barefoot through the dirt. Women carry ceramic jars on their heads toward the nearest water source. And this walk could take 30 minutes in each direction. 30 minutes there, 30 minutes back, with a 15-kilogram jar balanced on their head. And this was done at least twice a day. No running water, no well in the backyard. Water was an event, an effort, a mission that consumed hours and defined a woman's entire day. And here enters a detail that few notice. Remember the story of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well in the Gospel of John chapter 4? The text says she went to fetch water at noon, at the hottest hour, and the other women went early in the morning. Why did she go in the heat of midday? Because she was socially rejected. She had had 5 husbands and was living with a man who was not her husband. The other women didn't want her around. Going to the well wasn't just logistics, it was the social event of the day, the ancient equivalent of a neighborhood WhatsApp group. Going to the well was where women exchanged news, gossip, and information about births and deaths. Being excluded from this moment meant being cut off from the entire community. When you understand this, Jesus' conversation with that woman gains a completely different dimension. He wasn't just offering spiritual water, he was breaking a social isolation that had likely lasted for years. If this kind of detail is changing the way you see these stories, comment, "I didn't know." Because most people read the Bible without having any idea of the real world that existed behind those words. Now let's talk about food. And here is where the difference between the ancient world and ours becomes brutal. You probably had breakfast today. Maybe bread, maybe fruit, maybe eggs. 2,000 years ago, breakfast simply didn't exist as a concept for most people. The first meal of the day was in the middle of the morning, after having already worked for 3 or 4 hours. And what was this meal? Bread, just bread. Sometimes with a little olive oil for dipping, sometimes with olives. On good days, a piece of goat cheese. Meat was so rare that many families only ate real meat at religious festivals, 3 times a year, if that. Bread was the absolute center of their diet. It wasn't a side dish, it was the meal. Wheat and barley were the 2 grains that sustained the entire civilization, and barley was considered poor people's food, cheaper, coarser, less flavorful. When Jesus multiplied the loaves in John chapter 6, the text specifically says they were barley loaves. That detail is not accidental. The gospel writers are saying that the crowd following Jesus were poor people, people who ate the cheapest bread available, and preparing this bread was an insane amount of work. There was no bakery on the corner. Every family, and in practice every woman, had to make bread from scratch every single day. This meant grinding the grain by hand, using 2 circular stones called a millstone, one stone on top of the other, spinning, crushing grain by grain. Excavations in Galilean villages found these stones in practically every house. Each one weighed between 15 and 20 kilograms, and grinding enough flour to feed a family of 6 took between 2 and 3 hours. That was before kneading, fermenting, and baking. Jesus mentions this millstone twice in the Gospels. In Matthew, he says 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. In Mark, he talks about tying a millstone around someone's neck and throwing them into the sea. For us, these are metaphors. For those who heard them, it was the most concrete thing in the world. It was the heaviest and most present object inside every house. It was as if someone today said, "Tie a refrigerator around his neck." Everyone would understand the weight. Now think about the complete menu of an ordinary family. Barley bread, olives, lentils, chickpeas, dried figs, dates, and when the season allowed, cucumbers, onions, and garlic. Fish appeared more frequently in communities around the Sea of Galilee, and not by chance, several of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. Salted and dried fish was one of the few proteins accessible to those who were not wealthy. As for beef or lamb, absolute luxury. A lamb cost the equivalent of several weeks of work. When the father of the prodigal son ordered the fattened calf to be killed in the parable of Luke 15, the impact on those listening was enormous. That father wasn't just having a barbecue, he was spending the equivalent of an entire month of the family's income to celebrate the return of a son who had wasted everything. The extravagance was the point. And the wine? Yes, everyone drank wine, including children, but not for pleasure. Out of necessity. The water available in most places was contaminated. No treatment, no filtering, no chlorine. The alcohol in the wine functioned as a basic purifier. It was safer to drink diluted wine than pure water. When Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy, "Stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach," he is not prescribing recreational alcohol. He is giving medical advice. The water was making you sick. The wine kept you alive. But here is where daily life begins to reveal something that movies never show: disease. 2,000 years ago, the average life expectancy was between 30 and 35 years. Not because people couldn't live longer. If you survived childhood, you had a chance of reaching 50 or 60. The problem was that 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. Intestinal infections, dysentery, parasites, fevers, no antibiotics, no treated water, not the slightest notion of microbiology. Diarrhea that today is resolved with homemade saline solution killed babies in 2 days. Think about this. In a typical family of 6 or 7 children, 2 or 3 died in infancy. Every mother carried this reality. Every family lived with the death of children as a normal part of existence. When Jesus says in Mark, "Let the children come to me," he is speaking in a world where children were the most vulnerable and most disposable creatures in society. They had no legal status, no special protection, and many simply did not survive. The fact that Jesus stopped everything to give them attention was revolutionary. It wasn't cuteness, it was subversion. And when illness struck an adult, the options were almost none. Doctors as we know them did not exist. There were healers who mixed herbs, superstition, and prayer. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, tells the story of a woman who had suffered from hemorrhaging for 12 years, and had spent everything she had on doctors who only made her condition worse. This is not literary exaggeration. This was first-century medicine. Poultices of unknown herbs, purification rituals, potions made with ingredients ranging from crushed garlic to animal excrement. The Talmud records medical recipes from the time that include placing ash from burned bones mixed with goat fat over open wounds. If the disease didn't kill you, the treatment had a good chance of finishing the job. Leprosy, which in the Bible does not necessarily refer to modern leprosy but to a variety of skin diseases, was the ultimate nightmare. Not because of the pain, but because of the isolation. Leviticus 13 and 14 establish clear rules. The sick person must live outside the camp, must tear their clothes, cover their upper lip, and shout, "Unclean, unclean," whenever someone approaches. Visualize this. You are not just sick. You are forced to announce your own contamination, to scream to the world that no one should come near you. The stigma was so absolute that Jesus' healing of leprosy was not just a medical miracle, it was a complete social restoration. The healed leper could go back home. He could hug his children. He could enter the temple. He could be a human being again. But here is something that will catch you by surprise. With all this precariousness, mud houses, scarce food, disease everywhere, these people had a social and community structure that would make many modern metropolises seem deserted. Loneliness, which today is considered a global epidemic, practically did not exist, and the reason was simple: architecture. The houses of a Galilean village were not built separately, each on its own plot of land, with a fence and a gate. They were huddled together around a shared central courtyard. 3, 4, 5 houses of the same extended family opened their doors to the same courtyard. Grandparents, uncles, cousins, nephews, all living less than 10 steps from each other. The courtyard was the collective kitchen, the children's playground, the party hall, and the court for family disputes. There was no privacy, but there was also no abandonment. No one grew old alone. No one raised a child without help. No one suffered without witnesses. When Jesus speaks of loving your neighbor, the phrase gains a different weight when you realize that your neighbor was literally the person who lived 3 meters from your door, who heard your family arguing, who knew what you ate and what was missing from your table. And in this courtyard, at the center of everything, stood the communal oven, a dome-shaped clay structure called a tabun, where the women of the family took turns baking the day's bread. Think of the scene: 4 in the morning, the sky still dark, 3 or 4 women around the oven, the heat of the embers lighting their faces while they knead the flour and tell the news of the previous day. It was there that family decisions were actually made, not by the patriarch sitting in his chair, but by the women around the oven before the sun rose. If you are beginning to understand that life at that time was infinitely harder and at the same time more connected than ours, leave a like now. Because this video took weeks of research and every like helps it reach more people who need to see this. Now let's leave the house and step into the street. And when I say street, forget any image of paving or asphalt. In an ordinary village like Nazareth, which at the time of Jesus had between 200 and 400 inhabitants at most, the streets were hard-packed dirt trails between houses, narrow enough for two people to pass only by squeezing through. When it rained, these trails turned into rivers of mud mixed with animal waste. When it didn't rain, they turned into cloud of dust that stuck to the skin, eyes, and lungs. This is why washing feet was so important in Jewish culture. It wasn't a symbolic ritual, it was basic hygiene. Your feet were the dirtiest part of your body on any normal day, covered in mud, manure, and dust. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet at the Last Supper in John 13, he was taking the most disgusting and most servile task in the house, the work that belonged to the lowest slave in the domestic hierarchy, and doing it with his own hands. The message wasn't gentle, it was brutal. It was the equivalent of a king kneeling down and cleaning a servant's bathroom. But not everything was small villages and dust. 2,000 years ago, the land of Israel had cities that pulsed with an energy that rivals any modern urban center. And no city was more impressive than Jerusalem. If you came from the Galilean countryside, like most of Jesus' disciples, the sight of Jerusalem was something you would never forget as long as you lived. The city sat atop an elevation, surrounded by deep valleys on three sides, the Kidron Valley to the east, the Hinnom Valley to the south, and the Tyropoion Valley to the west. It was a natural fortress. And upon this fortress, Herod the Great had built something that defied reason. The Temple of Jerusalem, rebuilt by Herod starting in 19 BC, was a complex so massive that it covered an area equivalent to 27 soccer fields. The stones of the foundation weighed up to 570 tons, heavier than any block used in the pyramids of Egypt. Some of them measured 12 meters long by 3 meters high, and they were placed there without a crane, without a motor, without any technology that we know how to replicate easily today. The historian Flavius Josephus, who saw the temple with his own eyes before its destruction in 70 AD, wrote that the facade was covered with gold plates so thick that at sunrise, anyone looking directly at it was forced to avert their eyes, like looking directly at the sun. Pilgrims who came from the countryside and saw it for the first time fell to their knees, not out of devotion, out of shock. And Jerusalem during the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, transformed into madness. The city's population, which normally revolved around 40,000 people, exploded to 200,000, perhaps even 300,000 during Passover. Flavius Josephus reports that in a single Passover, 250,000 lambs were sacrificed in the temple. 250,000. Try to process that number. That is thousands of animals being slaughtered, skinned, and burned in a single day. The blood flowed through channels carved into the stone of the altar and emptied into the Kidron Valley. The river turned red. The smell of blood, burned meat, and incense rose like a thick cloud over the entire city. Some historians describe that it was possible to smell the temple from miles away. The pilgrims slept in improvised tents outside the walls, in the olive groves in the surrounding valleys. The city did not have the infrastructure to receive so many people. It was chaotic, noisy, dirty, and, for someone coming from a village of 200 people, absolutely overwhelming. Imagine Peter, Andrew, James, and John, fishermen from a village in the Galilean countryside, entering this chaos for the first time. The sound of thousands of voices in Aramaic, Greek, Latin. Merchants shouting prices, priests in white robes climbing the temple stairs, Roman soldiers in armor watching from strategic towers. It was the point where heaven and earth met. At least that's what every Jew believed, and it was exactly there, in this epicenter of religious, political, and economic power, that Jesus chose to overturn tables. But here is what no one tells you about Jerusalem. Underneath all that grandeur, the inequality was obscene. Excavations in the upper part of the city, the so-called Herodian Quarter, revealed mansions with mosaic floors, walls painted with frescoes in the Roman style, private ritual baths, and even indoor pools. These were the houses of the priestly elite, the Sadducees, the families of the high priests, the great merchants of the temple. Meanwhile, less than 800 meters away, in the lower part of the city, entire families huddled in rooms 3 meters by 3 meters, sharing space with rats and cockroaches without access to clean water. Jesus knew this geography. When he denounces the Pharisees in Matthew 23 for devouring widows' houses, he is not using figurative language. He is describing a real system where the religious elite exploited the most vulnerable through temple taxes, mandatory tithes, and a monopoly on the trade of sacrificial animals that inflated prices to a criminal point. A pair of doves, the cheapest sacrifice allowed for the poorest, came to cost in the Jerusalem temple the equivalent of 2 days' work. The sacrifice of the poor itself had become a tool of extortion. When a society uses religion to suck the resources from the weakest, how long until the entire building comes crashing down? In 70 AD, Jerusalem received its answer. But that is another story. Now let's talk about something that shaped every second of life in that era, and that has almost disappeared today: manual labor. 2,000 years ago, you were what your hands made. There was no abstract job, no office, no working with ideas. You were a farmer, shepherd, fisherman, carpenter, potter, tanner, weaver, or, at the bottom of the social scale, a day laborer. And each of these professions was a physical punishment. Let's take the most common one, farmer. 80% of the population lived off the land. You woke up before the sun, took a wooden plow pulled by an ox, if you had an ox, because many plowed with the strength of their own bodies, and tore through the stony soil of Judea for hours on end. The land of Israel is not the fertile plain of Egypt. It is full of stones, hills, limestone. Every hectare had to be cleared of stones by hand before planting. These stones were piled at the edges of the land, forming low walls that still mark the landscape today. When Jesus tells the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, the seed that falls on rock, the one that falls among thorns, the one that falls on good soil, he is not inventing scenarios. He is literally describing what any farmer saw every day: stony ground, thorn bushes, and once in a while, a stretch of soil that actually produced. If you believe that understanding the real context transforms the way we read the Bible, comment, context is everything, because this level of detail changes every parable, every miracle, every conversation. And now, let's go to a profession that directly touches the life of Jesus: carpenter. Or rather, the Greek word used in the Gospels is tekton, which does not mean exactly a carpenter as we imagine. A tekton was more than that. He was a builder, someone who worked with wood, but also with stone, who made doors, plows, yokes for oxen, frames, roof beams, and who, when necessary, helped raise walls. Wood was scarce in Judea. The great forests were in Lebanon, and importing cedar from there was something for a king, not a villager. So the local tekton worked with what he had: olive, sycamore, acacia, hardwoods, difficult to cut, requiring sharp tools and strong arms. Jesus worked in this profession probably from age 13 to 30, 17 years, carrying beams, cutting logs, fitting joints. His hands were not the soft hands that Renaissance art painted. They were calloused, scratched hands with wood splinters driven under the fingernails. When he took a whip of cords and drove the money changers out of the temple, he was not an indignant intellectual. He was a manual laborer with 17 years of accumulated physical strength. And here is another profession that appears all the time in the Gospels and that reveals much about life at the time: fishermen. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, which is actually a freshwater lake, 21 kilometers long by 13 wide. Fishing was done at night, almost always. The fish rose to shallower waters in the dark, and the nets were cast between sunset and dawn. The fishermen spent the entire night in wooden boats, 7 to 8 meters long, and in 1986, one of these boats was found at the bottom of the lake, preserved in the mud for 2,000 years. It had exactly the dimensions the texts describe and held between 5 and 10 people. Night fishing meant working in almost total darkness, in the cold. The temperature over the lake at night dropped to 6 or 7 degrees, and with the constant risk of sudden storms. The Sea of Galilee is surrounded by hills, and strong winds descend through these gorges without warning, creating waves up to 2 meters high in minutes. When the Gospels describe the disciples in a panic during a storm, they are not inexperienced sailors exaggerating. They are professionals of the lake who recognized when a storm was truly dangerous. And after a whole night of work, the fishermen returned to land for the second shift, cleaning the nets, repairing them, salting them so they wouldn't rot, and preparing the fish, salting, drying, and selling in the market before it spoiled under the sun. There was no refrigeration. Every fish was a race against time and bacteria. But what truly separated that world from ours, more than technology, more than medicine, more than comfort, was something invisible that controlled every aspect of life: ritual purity. And if you don't understand this concept, you will read the entire New Testament without understanding half of what is happening. 2,000 years ago, the universe was divided into 2 absolute categories: pure and impure. It wasn't a matter of hygiene, although it had hygienic consequences. It was a cosmological matter. Certain things, people, places, and moments were sacred, clean, acceptable before God, and others were contaminated by impurity. A kind of spiritual pollution that spread through contact like an invisible virus. Touching a corpse made you impure for 7 days. Touching someone who touched a corpse made you impure until evening. Eating pork, camel, rabbit, or any animal that did not have a split hoof and chew the cud, impure. Having any kind of bodily discharge, blood, semen, pus, made you impure for periods ranging from a day to weeks. And as long as you were impure, you could not enter the temple, you could not participate in community meals, you could not touch another person without contaminating them. This wasn't theory. This was the operating code of the entire society. And now, reread the Gospels through this lens. Jesus touches a leper, scandal. Jesus is touched by a woman with a hemorrhage, automatic contamination. Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners, complete ritual pollution. Every miracle, every gesture, every meal of Jesus was a political and theological declaration against a system that excluded the sick, the poor, and the marginalized from the presence of God. He wasn't just healing, he was demolishing boundaries. And this is just the surface. Because what happened inside the temple walls, behind the scenes of religious power, in the rituals that no one saw, that will shock you in a way you don't expect. Let's enter the temple, not through the front door, through the back door, through the side the pilgrims never saw. Because the Temple of Jerusalem was not just a place of prayer, it was a machine. An economic, political, and religious machine so sophisticated it would make any modern corporation look like an amateur. The temple employed, according to Flavius Josephus, more than 18,000 workers during the period of construction and renovation under Herod. 18,000. And when the renovation finally finished, ironically, only 6 years before the total destruction in 70 AD, The priestly elite was so worried about mass unemployment that they began to pave the streets of Jerusalem with white stone just to keep the workers busy. But the permanent jobs of the temple were something else. There were shifts of priests, 24 divisions, each serving 2 weeks a year. There were Levites who took care of the music, the gates, the cleaning. There were specialized butchers who knew how to slit an animal's throat in a single precise cut, because the law required the death to be quick and the blood to drain completely. There were animal inspectors who examined every lamb, every dove, every goat before the sacrifice to ensure it had no defect, no blemish, no fracture, no hair out of place. A rejected animal meant money thrown away for the pilgrim who had traveled days to bring it, and that is exactly where the system became perverse, because the temple didn't accept just any animal, and the inspectors, who answered directly to the families of the high priests, had a financial incentive to reject the animals that pilgrims brought from home. Why? Because inside the temple complex there was an official market where you could buy pre-approved animals for sacrifice. And the prices in this market were controlled by whom? The same priestly families who controlled the inspectors. The Talmud preserves an extraordinary record. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel was so outraged by the price of doves in the temple that he intervened publicly, and the price dropped from a gold denarius to a quarter of a silver denarius, a reduction of more than 90% in a single day. This means that before the intervention, the price was inflated by more than 90%, and doves were the sacrifice of the poor, of women after childbirth, of healed lepers who needed ritual certification to return to society. The most vulnerable paid the highest price. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple, he didn't have a random fit of anger. He surgically attacked the exact point where the exploitation was most brutal. The tables of the money changers, because there was another perverse detail. The temple did not accept Roman currency. Currency with the emperor's face was considered idolatry, so every pilgrim was forced to exchange their money for temple currency, the Tyrian shekel, and the money changers charged an exchange rate that varied between 4 and 8%, on top of already inflated prices. It was an extraction funnel that began at the gate and ended at the altar, and the blood. We need to talk about the blood, because it is impossible to understand the temple without understanding the industrial scale of what happened there. The main altar stood in the court of the priests, a stone platform 4.5 meters high and nearly 15 meters wide. At the top were 4 horns, protrusions at the corners where the blood was sprinkled. At the base of the altar, channels carved into the stone collected the blood and directed to a drainage system that passed under the courtyard and emptied into the Kidron Valley. On normal days, dozens of animals were sacrificed. On feast days, thousands. The Mishnah, the compilation of Jewish oral law, describes the procedure with a clinical precision that reveals the routine. The priest held the animal, cut the jugular and carotid with a sharp knife without serrations, collected the blood in a silver or gold basin, passed the basin to another priest who sprinkled it at the base of the altar, while a third was already skinning the animal and separating the parts that would be burned from those that would be given to the priests as payment. It was an assembly line, efficient, fast, practiced thousands of times until it became an automatic movement. The smell was something that no text can completely convey, but several try. Fat burning on hot stone, fresh blood in the dry air, incense, a specific mixture of 11 spices whose formula was guarded as a state secret, burning on the golden altar inside the sanctuary, wool wet with animal sweat, manure, and over all this, the sound, mooing, bleating, the singing of the Levites in chorus, silver trumpets sounding specific ritual moments, the murmur of hundreds of priests reciting blessings. If you closed your eyes inside the temple complex, it would be a total assault on the senses, and that was exactly how it was supposed to be. The temple was designed to overwhelm you with the presence of God, or at least with the presence of the power that claimed to represent God. And there was a chamber at the heart of all this that was the holiest place on the planet, the Holy of Holies, in Hebrew, Kodesh HaKodashim. A perfect cube of 10 meters by 10 meters by 10 meters, separated from the rest of the temple by a curtain, actually two curtains, woven with threads of blue, purple and scarlet, with embroidery of cherubim. This curtain was, according to the Talmud, the thickness of a palm, about 8 centimeters, and was so heavy that supposedly 300 priests were needed to move it when it had to be washed. It may be rabbinic exaggeration, but the point is clear. That barrier was impenetrable. Inside the Holy of Holies in the first Temple of Solomon sat the Ark of the Covenant. But in the second temple, the temple that existed in Jesus' time, the Ark had already disappeared. The room was empty. A bare rock on the floor, called the Even Hashatia, the foundation stone, marked the place where the Ark should have been. The holiest place of the oldest monotheistic religion in the world was, in practice, an empty room with a stone on the floor. And only one person could enter there, the high priest, once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. He entered alone, with incense burning to create a cloud of smoke that theoretically prevented him from seeing the divine presence directly, because seeing God meant dying. According to tradition, the other priests tied a rope around his ankle in case he died inside and had to be pulled out without anyone else entering. The tension of that moment was absolute. All the people waited in silence in the outer courtyard. If the high priest came out alive, it meant that God had accepted the people's atonement for another year. If he didn't come out, but he always did, at least in the records we have, the implication would be catastrophic. Now keep all this in your head: the blood, the gold, the incense, the impenetrable curtain, the empty room, the high priest with the rope around his ankle, and read Matthew 27, verse 51. At the moment of Jesus' death on the cross, the text says, "And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom, from top to bottom." Not from bottom to top, as if human hands had pulled it. From top to bottom, as if something or someone had torn that barrier from above. The wall between the sacred and the profane, between God and humanity, between the pure and the impure, torn. You can read this as a metaphor. You can read it as a literal event. But in any reading, the message is the same. The system is over. The monopoly on mediation between God and human beings, controlled by a priestly elite that charged for access, was declared obsolete in a single cosmic gesture. And if you think this declaration had no practical consequences, wait, because what happened in the following 40 years transformed the world. But before we get there, we need to talk about something that affected half the population and that rarely appears in sermons or documentaries: the lives of women. Because if life was hard for men at that time, for women it was a parallel universe of restrictions that most of us can't even imagine. A woman in first century Judea existed legally as property, first of her father, then of her husband. She could not testify in court. Her testimony was considered as reliable as that of a slave or a child. She could not initiate a divorce. Only the man had that right. She could not inherit property, except in very specific circumstances where there were no male heirs. Her formal education in the Torah was, at best, limited. Rabbi Eliezer, one of the great masters of the first century, stated bluntly, "Whoever teaches his daughter Torah is as if he teaches her obscenity." Think of the weight of that sentence. The sacred text, the text that defined the identity of the entire people, was considered too dangerous for half the population. Marriage happened early. A girl could be betrothed from the age of 12 and a half. In practice, most married between 13 and 15. The groom was generally older, between 18 and 25, And marriage was not the woman's choice. It was a negotiation between the bride's father and the future husband, involving a price, the mohar, paid by the groom to the bride's family. It wasn't buying in the modern sense, but it was a transaction, and the bride's virginity was a contractual condition. Deuteronomy 22 details what happened if the husband alleged the bride was not a virgin. Her parents had to present the proof of virginity, the sheet from the wedding night, before the elders of the city. If the proof was not satisfactory, the woman could be stoned at the door of her father's house. This was the world in which Mary, the mother of Jesus, received the announcement that she would become pregnant before marriage. It wasn't a social inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. When Joseph considers leaving her secretly in Matthew 1, he is literally saving her life by not exposing the situation publicly. The story of Christmas gains completely different contours when you understand what was at stake. And in daily life, the woman worked more hours than any man in the house. She woke up before everyone else to light the oven and prepare the bread. She carried water, and carrying water meant walking to the nearest spring or cistern, filling clay jars that weighed between 15 and 20 kilograms when full, and balancing them on her head or hip on the way back, sometimes more than once a day. She ground the grain by hand in a stone mill. 2 circular stones, one over the other, turned for hours until wheat became flour. Archaeologists found these mills in practically every excavated house, and analysis of the skeletons of first-century women shows severe wear on the joints of the knees, hips, and shoulders, marks of a lifetime of repetitive and heavy labor. She spun wool, wove fabric, sewed clothes. She cared for the children, and with an infant mortality rate around 30%, caring for children also meant burying children. A typical first-century woman could have 6 to 9 pregnancies over her lifetime and see 3 or 4 of those children die before age 5. Try to absorb that. The pain of losing a child, which today, fortunately, is a tragic exception, was for those women a statistical probability that repeated itself several times throughout life. It is in this context that Jesus' attitude toward women becomes not only unusual, but revolutionary to the point of being scandalous. He spoke with women in public, something a respectable rabbi simply did not do. The Talmud records the dominant opinion, do not talk too much with a woman, not even with your own wife, let alone with the wife of another. The disciples were amazed. The Greek word is ithomazon, which carries a tone of shock, when they found Jesus talking alone with the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. He not only spoke with women, he taught them. The scene of Mary sitting at Jesus' feet in Luke 10, listening to his word, uses the technical expression for a disciple receiving instruction from a teacher. Mary wasn't just listening to a conversation. She was in the formal position of a disciple. And when Martha complains that Mary should be in the kitchen, Jesus responds that Mary has chosen the better part. He publicly validated a woman's right to study instead of serve. In a world where teaching Torah to a woman was compared to teaching obscenity, this scene is a bombshell. And there were women who financed Jesus' entire ministry. Luke 8, verses 2 and 3, lists their names: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. This phrase is easy to read fast and not notice what it is saying. Wealthy women, some connected to political power, were using their own financial resources to support an itinerant rabbi and his followers. In a society where women did not control money, these women not only had resources, but directed them toward a religious movement that challenged the establishment. And it is women who are at the foot of the cross when all the male disciples have fled. It is women who go to the tomb on Sunday morning, and, in the most subversive detail of all, it is to a woman, Mary Magdalene, that the risen Christ first appears and commands, "Go and tell my brothers." He transforms a woman whose testimony was not accepted in court into the first witness and messenger of the resurrection. If the authors of the Gospels were inventing the story, they would never have chosen a woman as the first witness. It would have destroyed the credibility of the account in the ancient world. The fact that they kept this detail is, for many historians, one of the strongest arguments that they were recording what actually happened, because it was too embarrassing to be invented. Now let's change direction completely and talk about something that will seem mundane, but reveals more about that world than any temple theology. Food. Because those people's relationship with food was fundamentally different from anything we know. Today, food is abundance, it is choice, it is opening an app and having 40 restaurants on the screen. 2,000 years ago, food was anxiety. It was uncertainty. It was the question that dominated every day. Will there be enough? The basic diet was what historians call the Mediterranean triad: bread, olive oil, and wine. These three items made up between 60 and 70% of all calories consumed. Barley bread, not wheat, because barley was cheaper and more drought-resistant, was the main food. Kneaded with coarse flour, baked in the taban, hard enough to break a tooth if it got old. When Jesus says, "I am the bread of life," he is choosing the most universal, most basic and most essential symbol of that culture. It is not a luxury, it is survival. Olive oil was the second pillar. But don't think of extra virgin cold-pressed olive oil in a dark bottle. First-century olive oil was fatty, cloudy, with a strong flavor that varied enormously from harvest to harvest. And it wasn't used only in food. It was fuel for lamps, the only night lighting available. It was medicine, applied to wounds as a rudimentary antiseptic. It was a cosmetic, rubbed on the skin and hair as a moisturizer and sunscreen. It was currency. An olive grove was the most valuable asset a family could have, and it took between 15 and 20 years for a young olive tree to produce fruit in commercial quantities. Planting an olive tree was an investment made not for yourself, but for your children. When Jesus prayed on the Mount of Olives the night before his death, he was surrounded by trees that represented generations of care, investment, and family hope. Some of those olive trees may have been planted by the great-grandparents of people who were alive that night. And the wine. Wine was not a social drink or a luxury. It was a caloric and, more importantly, a sanitary necessity. The water available in most villages came from cisterns that collected rainwater or from natural springs that were frequently contaminated. Wine, even diluted as was the custom, had antimicrobial properties that made the water safer to drink. The standard ratio was between 2 and 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking pure wine, undiluted, was considered barbarian behavior, something Greeks and Romans associated with peoples they considered savage. When Jesus turns water into wine at the wedding in Cana, he is not providing a luxury, he is providing a basic necessity, and the detail that it was good wine, the master of ceremonies says you have saved the best wine until now, is significant because good wine meant healthy grapes, it meant a good harvest, it meant divine blessing in the mindset of the time. The miracle was not just practical, it was symbolic of abundance in a world of chronic scarcity. Meat was rare, brutally rare. Forget the idea of eating meat every day or even every week. For most of the population, meat appeared on the table on specific occasions, religious festivals, weddings, births. A roasted lamb at Passover, a goat at a family celebration. Outside these occasions, protein came from legumes, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans, and, for those living near the Sea of Galilee, fish. Salted and dried fish was the fast food of the first century. It could be transported, stored for weeks, and reconstituted with water before eating. It is almost certainly the type of fish that Jesus multiplied along with the loaves to feed the crowds. It wasn't fresh grilled fish. It was dried and salted fish, portable, durable and cheap. And the multiplication of loaves and fishes, when you understand the dietary context, is not just impressive for its scale, it is devastating for its message. In a world where hunger was a constant threat, where every piece of bread represented hours of work, where entire families lived on the margin between enough and starvation, someone multiplying food was the ultimate miracle. Not healing a disease, not calming a storm, food. Because at the end of the day, before any theology, before any debate about ritual purity, before any discussion about the Messiah, the most urgent and most human question was always the same. What are we going to eat tomorrow? And that question, what are we going to eat tomorrow, leads us to something that controlled everything, the seasons. Because life 2,000 years ago was not governed by clocks or office calendars. It was governed by the rain. Israel has two seasons, the dry season from April to October and the rainy season from November to March. And everything, absolutely everything, revolved around this division. The early rain of October and November softened the soil for planting. The late rain of March and April soaked the earth one last time before the harvest. If the early rain was late, planting was delayed and the harvest decreased. If the late rain didn't come, the grains dried up before ripening. A single bad season meant hunger. 2 seasons in a row meant catastrophe. There was no strategic grain reserve. There was no fast importation. There was no safety net. You depended totally, completely, absolutely on the sky. And when the Bible speaks of God controlling the rain, of God opening and closing the heavens, that is not poetry. It is the description of who controls whether you and your children will eat or not next year. The prayer for rain was not abstract devotion. It was desperation. It was the most practical and most urgent thing a person could ask for. And that was exactly why the Jewish religious calendar was stitched to the agricultural seasons in a way that we today have completely lost. Passover, Pesach, fell in the spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. 7 weeks later came Shavuot, Pentecost, celebrating the wheat harvest. And in the autumn, Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, marked the end of the harvest of fruits, olive oil, and wine. The 3 great pilgrimage festivals, the 3 moments when every Jewish man was supposed to go up to Jerusalem, coincided exactly with the 3 most critical agricultural moments of the year. Religion and survival were the same thing. Thanking God and thanking for food was a single gesture. And when you understand this, you understand why the tithe, the giving of 10% of production to the temple, was not felt as a generous donation. It was felt as a tax, because it was a tax. And on top of it were piled others: the terumah for the priests, the ma'aser for the Levites, the ma'aser sheni, which had to be spent in Jerusalem during the festivals, and every 3 years, the ma'aser ani for the poor. Adding it all up, a Jewish farmer gave between 20 and 30% of his production in religious obligations, in addition to Roman taxes. And Roman taxes were not light. Rome charged the tributum soli, tax on the land, and the tributum capitis, poll tax. There were toll fees on the roads, taxes on goods in the ports, taxes on sales in the markets. And who collected these taxes? The publicans, the tax collectors who appear in the Gospels as synonyms for sinners. And there was a reason for this hatred. The Roman system worked by leasing. Rome auctioned off the right to collect taxes from a region, and the publican who won the contract could collect whatever he wanted above the official quota, keeping the difference. It was a system that incentivized extortion. Zacchaeus, the short tax collector who climbed the tree to see Jesus in Luke 19, was rich. The text says this explicitly, and he was rich because he had spent years extracting as much as possible from his compatriots in the name of Rome. When he says, "I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have extorted anyone, I return 4 times as much," he is confessing an entire system. And Jesus responds, "Today salvation has come to this house, not after a pilgrimage, not after a sacrifice in the temple, not after years of penance. Today, there, at that moment, this immediacy was as strange in that world as it would be in ours. Now put it all together. Take the average Galilean farmer in the year 30 of the Common Era. He lives in a one-room stone house with a hard-packed dirt floor. He shares the space with his wife, 4 or 5 children, and probably his own elderly parents. He wakes up before the sun. He works the land with tools his grandfather would recognize. He eats barley bread, olives, lentils, and, if he's lucky, a piece of goat cheese. He gives between 20 and 30% of the harvest to the temple, and as much again to Rome. He doesn't know how to read. He has never traveled more than 30 kilometers from where he was born. He has already buried at least 2 children. He has chronic pain in his back and knees. His teeth are worn down by the sand that mixes with the flour. He will die statistically before age 50, and if he reaches 50, he will be considered old. His wife has already worked more that day before noon than most of us work in an entire week. She carried water, ground grain, kneaded bread, lit the fire, breastfed a baby, and watched a 3-year-old at the same time. She knows that the next pregnancy could kill her because she has already seen it happen to her neighbor, her cousin, her sister, and at night, when the single oil lamp casts flickering shadows on the stone walls, this family gathers and does what families have done since the beginning of time. They tell stories. Stories of Abraham, of Moses, of David, stories of a God who takes slaves out of Egypt and topples giants with sling stones, stories that say, night after night, this is not all there is. There is something greater. There is someone who sees. There is a plan. And it is in this world, not in the clean and bright world of Hollywood movies, not in the golden world of Renaissance paintings, but in this world of mud, sweat, blood, and uncertainty, that the words of Jesus land. Blessed are the poor. He is not speaking to a middle-class audience seeking self-help. He is speaking to people who don't know if they will eat next week. Do not worry about what you will eat or wear. He is saying this to people whose only daily concern is exactly that. Consider the lilies of the field. They do not labor or spin, and I tell you that not even Solomon in all his glory was dressed like one of these. He is pointing to wildflowers on the side of the road and telling exhausted and hungry farmers that the God of the universe cares for flowers, and that they are worth more than flowers. This message, in this context for these people, was not philosophy. It was oxygen. It was someone telling invisible people that they were seen. And perhaps that is exactly what connects us to them across 2,000 years of distance. Because despite all our technology, despite our hospitals and supermarkets and antibiotics, the fundamental question remains the same. It hasn't changed. It won't change. The question that Galilean farmer asked as he looked at the dry October sky, waiting for rain, is the same one you ask at 3 in the morning when sleep won't come. Is anyone watching? Does all of this have a purpose? Does suffering make sense? And that is why these 2,000-year-old texts continue to be the most read, the most translated, and the most debated in human history. Not because they describe a better world, but because, in the middle of the harshest world most of us can imagine, someone heard a voice saying there was hope, and believed it enough to write it down. It is easy to romanticize the past. It is easy to look at linen clothes and olive trees and shepherds with their staffs and think it was a simpler, purer, more authentic life. It wasn't. It was brutal. It was short. It was marked by pain, loss, and endless work. Those people didn't choose simplicity. They had no alternative. And the fact that even under these conditions, they produced texts, traditions, and ideas that shaped the entire Western civilization and much of the Eastern is not a curious detail. It is perhaps the most impressive phenomenon in human history, because the final question is not how they lived. The final question is, what did they have that made them survive? And what, of everything they left us, are we still carrying 2 millennia later without even realizing it? If this video impressed you, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I guarantee it will surprise you even more.